First off, my name's Joey. I'm a 2L here and a repeat player at Critical Corporate Theory Lab.
Hi everyone, my name is Leah Kayali. I am a 2L, former classmate of those in the Critical Corporate Theory Lab, student of Professor Hansen, and had the privilege of talking to Briahna last time she came to HLS last year.
Okay, we would like to extend our sincerest gratitude to our esteemed guest, Briahna Joy Gray, for joining us today to speak on corporate capture. After graduating from Harvard Law School in 2011, Briahna has gone on to achieve a remarkable rise in political prominence as a hard-hitting journalist and the National Press Secretary for the 2020 Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. She began her career as a professional journalist in 2018 at The Intercept. She has also contributed to Rolling Stone, The Guardian, New York Magazine, and is the contributing editor for Current Affairs. Briahna hosts her own podcast, Bad Faith, which attracts tens of thousands of subscribers, and co-hosts the Hills web series Rising. Put broadly, Briahna is an outspoken critic of political corruption among the powerful and endeavors to recenter the narrative on improving the material conditions for the working class and marginalized people. These are the values we try to emulate in our work for the FLAW. Thank you again for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. It's such a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Of course. I'll start off with the first question. So corporations have infiltrated every facet of our political system, legislative, executive, and even judicial. Corporate influence is so ubiquitous, many people see this as an inevitability instead of a set of intentional policy choices. To provide direction through this monstrous array of issues, our discussion today will center on the corporate capture of legislative politics. Briahna, you were a key member of the Sanders 2020 presidential campaign, which prided itself on bucking corporate influence and representing the working class. Could you tell us about what led you to the Sanders campaign and how it interacted with and navigated through an antagonistic captured system?
Yeah, so in 2016, when Bernie first ran, I was a corporate lawyer in New York, and it was probably the first time that I had heard a presidential candidate, at least, who was talking about my values, both my political and kind of broader moral, humanistic values, in a way that felt uncompromising. Someone I actually wanted to actively support as opposed to someone I wanted to vote for to hold off the worser option on the other side of the aisle, kind of a lesser of two evilism. And it was incredibly exciting because the fact that he was saying things like healthcare is a human right, housing is a human right, it unlocked in me, the same way I think it did in a lot of other people, the realization that the things that we dreamed of weren't politically unpragmatic the way that we had been told, but there actually could be a figure who pursued our actual goals as opposed to these kind of compromised positions. So it was very frustrating to me when there were a number of media narratives circulating around him at that time that focused on this idea that he was insufficiently appealing to Black voters, a weaponization of a certain kind of, I think, inauthentic identity politics that was used to cover for the extent to which his opponent had policies and a record that had been very hostile to the interests of those same marginalized groups that the media at the time purported to care about. So about a year after Bernie lost, I started freelancing, tackling some of these themes, and the writing was much more popular than I had anticipated. And it eventually led to this career at The Intercept. And after about 10 months, not even a year at The Intercept, the Bernie campaign reached out to me. So it was such a unexpected career shift that I still have a hard time thinking about myself as someone who is in politics. I think of myself as someone who had a value system and had these opportunities to pursue it and to pursue it politically. And in the context of the Bernie campaign, I mean, one of the things that he said so frequently was that because of his willingness to be more openly hostile and adversarial to corporate interests, there would be an alignment against him that was unlike anything that we were really used to in a political sphere. That even the Democratic Party itself, because of the nature of the funding base of both of our two major corporate parties, was going to be hostile to him in a way that was unanticipated, relatively unanticipated historically. You know, he often references FDR, but in more recent memory. And that, of course, was true. When you look at the amount of earned media, media that isn't paid for by a campaign, but is beneficial to a candidate, let's say after they win a primary, or just because the media is rooting for them, as it were. We saw an incredible imbalance when you looked at Bernie versus the other candidates. When he won Nevada, which was a really huge moment for the campaign, it was the most diverse state to date to date that had voted thus far. Bernie won 70% of the Latino vote. It was very difficult for the Bernie bro narratives to persist at that moment. The next day, we got a bunch of kind of Russiagating press about how Putin really wanted Bernie to win. You know, it was stuff like that. And for us, it was unsurprising because we understood that this was the consequence of saying that I'm not going to take any billionaire donations, I'm not going to take any corporate donations. Bernie was out fundraising the rest of the field with small dollar donations from regular people. And that really has a genuine impact on the kinds of policies you're able to pursue. And I think you saw that when, you know, everyone knows that we're in a healthcare crisis. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, if you bring up the idea of Medicare for All, or the fact that people shouldn't die of a preventable disease or not be able to get treated for something like cancer because they're poor or because they lost their job or because their spouse lost the job, you will not find anybody who disagrees with that anywhere you go in America. And so how do you beat that? Well, all the other primary candidates have to at least superficially support something along the lines of Medicare for All, something that sounds like Medicare for All, maybe Medicare for All who want it per Pete Buttigieg. But if you are in fact taking as much corporate money as those other people were, you have to bend the knee. And we saw the kind of degradation of that messaging from that moment when Kamala Harris raised her hand at the debate saying that she would support ending private health insurance to the immediate backtrack the next day. And so that's just an example of what you have to kind of go up against. It's the corporate media itself that's aligned against you, that's fueled by corporate advertising dollars, and those same advertising dollars, those same institutions are paying corporatized candidates. It's a real uphill battle.
So we kind of wanted to dive a little bit into how these dynamics of corporate influence are playing out in our current congressional makeup. And I'll just note, Briahna, if you're not aware, Joey and I have the interesting dynamic of you're behind us, and we know you see us this way, so if we're doing a lot of swiveling, that's why. But
down there.
But something that you tackled in a recent episode of your podcast, Bad Faith, was the railroad workers' strike and the sort of strikebreaker bill that ended up passing through Congress. And you and your guests on the show sort of tackled head on how the railroad companies, you know, in the last 10, 15 years have raked in an astounding $183 billion in profits and stock buybacks, where, you know, at the end of this whole process, the workers never got the paid sick leave that they were demanding. And something that I appreciated that you brought, you know, into the conversation was that, you know, progressives, I think all of the squad members except for perhaps Rashida Tlaib, I might be missing the details, did end up voting for that bill to break the strike. And so, you know, I'm curious if you could get into a little bit from your perspective, was this naked influence of corporate power? Was this miscalculated strategy? Was something else afoot? How, you know, I think this feels like a very recent and very clear example of corporate capture in some way influencing Congress. So if you could just, share your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a big question. The question of whether, you know, what part's corporate capture, what part strategy failure this is. And labeling that specifically has been subject of an enormous amount of consternation and arguing and debate among leftists. So let's just accept for the moment that from the squad members' perspective, it's just bad strategy. Let's just accept that on face value because I can't know what's anybody's hearts and minds. And they don't take corporate money. And to the extent that there's corporate influence there, it's a more difficult connection to chart. It would have something more to do with influence from party leadership, coercion over committee appointments, or whatever other kinds of power levers they have within Congress, as opposed to kind of more the direct, I give you money, I expect something from you, lobbying that is usually, is principally the case, or at least most obviously the case. Okay, so about a week, okay, let's start, where do we start? Rail workers wanted time off. They did not have any. This is not one of those cases, I recently talked about on the Hill, I think it was yesterday, Candace Owens put out a clip in which she was just described Amazon workers as wanting to go on strike because they just wanted like 3-hour lunch breaks and the ability to work from home. Like people weren't urinating in bottles and defecating in bags because they weren't given enough time to go to take even bathroom breaks, as though an Amazon employee didn't die on the warehouse floor and wasn't left there for 20 minutes until someone administered any kind of aid. Yeah, those are the conditions that people obviously are pushing back against, right? In the railroad context, they had absolutely no time off. They couldn't schedule time off, and the reason wasn't just an abstract kind of a villain story. What was happening is that the railroads had moved to a scheduling system called PSR, Precision System Railroads, I think is what the acronym stands for. But at any rate, it means that there is a very tight schedule where trains don't stop along the tracks the way they used to in olden year, pick this up, put that up, drop that off. It's more efficient for them to basically take longer trips with fewer breaks and have really, really tight schedules that basically don't allow for there to be as much flexibility in the worker schedules anymore. And that's part of why there was even a more extreme ballooning in profit for the railroad industry. And that's key to keep in mind, because there's often a kind of material backing for a lot of the political decisions that are being made. And without that being a part of the conversation, people can have, I think, undue faith in their ability to make certain kind of changes or have certain kind of allies, and I'll explain that. I'll explain that further. So the fight over sick days, the reason why you couldn't just say, okay, fine, I'll give you 1 sick day, I'll give you 3 sick days, I'll give you 5 sick days. There was no compromise like that between what the railroad workers and what the industry perhaps would have wanted, because there's no in-between ground when it comes to PSR, to the scheduling system. So everyone knows this. This is not a new fight. They've been having the current contract fight for 3 years now. And it's worth noting that they, like other federal employees, have the ability to have sick days extended to them by the government by executive order. Barack Obama did this when he was president, but intentionally, specifically excluded railroad workers, probably because of this pressure from the railroad industry not to undermine their ability to use this particular scheduling process. Okay, here comes Joe Biden, who has presented himself as the most union-friendly president since FDR. He's also the president who has taken more corporate money than anybody else in the Democratic primary and more billionaire money than anybody else in the Democratic primary. So if you have that kind of more material understanding of what people's motivations are, as opposed to kind of hoping and praying that, oh, Biden seems like a good guy, or et cetera, it perhaps is unsurprising to you that when 400, I believe it was, business leaders write to Joe Biden about a week or so before all of the votes went down, he has to keep an ear open to that. Those are his constituents. In actuality, those are the people who put him in office. And the business industry was united in not wanting the strike to happen. That was number one priority, and you saw the corporate media also coalesce around this narrative, right? It's gonna ruin Christmas. You're not gonna get little Timmy, his Tonka truck, whatever the kids are playing with these days, his Game Boy, I don't know. I'm obviously an 80s baby. What is it now? What game system do the kids even use now? I don't even know. The point is, you can't get your kids the toys they want for Christmas. There's going to be interruptions to the water supply. These evil rail workers want to bring the government to a halt. Now, the framing, of course, was not, wow, they're asking for something that's so minimal, something that all of you get to have, something that's federally protected for all of these other employees. Why is it that all of the bargaining onus is put on them as though they're the bad actors? And that's where you get these narratives like the one that Candace Owens was spreading, right? There was a lot of, well, they must be asking for a lot. But in this instance, railroad workers are such a kind of quintessential, kind of in the American imagination, body of workers. They have, hard hats, they're men, they work hard, it's a skilled profession. They were less easy to malign than certain other cohorts of workers that of course are equally valuable and meritorious, but like service industry workers who are routinely characterized as dumb, nose-pierced baristas who couldn't get a job because they majored in basket weaving or whatever else Sean Hannity is going to say on a given day. So there was this real tension because there was a good deal of public support for these rail workers despite the media doing its best work. But it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, Joe Biden has the power to crush this strike. And that's, in fact, what happened. With respect to the so Joe Biden is, my impression is that he catered to the business interests that put him into office. When it comes to why the Democrats in Congress and the squad members specifically voted the way they did, the narrative is that there was a very savvy negotiation by Pramila Jayapal to include the sick day package along with the rest of the agreement, which was the agreement that the rail workers had already voted down, right? The non-sick day package agreement. It's a non-agreement. That's an agreement that's being forced onto these workers, undermining the whole point of them being in a union, their right to union and withhold their labor in order to get the contract they actually want. But the narrative was that Pramila Jayapal had finagled some old-timey congressional rule that would force them to pass both of these things at the first time to get them out of the House. So that even if there was this opposition among Republicans, let's say, I don't think it's really just Republicans, but let's just go with that. Even if there is this opposition among Republicans to the sick day leave, that it has a shot of passing the Senate because we can get it out of the House, right? And if there, we had at the time 50 votes in the Senate, there was a possibility that you could maybe get enough people to cross the line because rail workers were so sympathetic, because there was so much public pressure, and they actually could pass the 7-day work leave. Now, because of that rule, that meant that whatever if the non-sick day passage passed the House, the other bill would come through with it. They didn't need the squad members' votes to actually get it into the Senate, right? So the squad members could have, perhaps only performatively, but could have said, we are not going to vote for something. We're not going to vote for this part of the bill that constructively strips these laborers of their right to unionize and withhold their vote and forces this contract on them, forces them to accept this contract that they've been trying to vote. They have in fact voted down and been trying to resist for 3 years now. But they voted for it anyway. And the narrative was, we had to do it so that it at least could get a shot at passing this, the 7-day sick leave that went with it could get a shot of passing the Senate. This is all very in the weeds, and it's very frustrating to have to talk about these things in the weeds because they're designed to be opaque and for the American public to swallow that everyone did their best. It was all that could be done. The squad members gave it a Hail Mary pass. Everyone was making their best efforts. The Democrats fought hard, but somehow Republicans meant that this couldn't happen. It had nothing to do with Republicans. Because the other part of this is, from a pro-labor perspective, it's a win-win if this thing dies in the House or if it's vetoed by Joe Biden. Because if an agreement isn't settled upon, the next step is for the workers to actually go on strike. And then we all discover how much their labor is actually valued. If everyone is afraid that little Timmy doesn't get his Christmas toys, if everyone really is afraid that we're gonna not be able to sanitize our water supply because the trains are the ones that bring the chemicals to do so, if we are really afraid of all of these downstream effects that are genuinely significant, then I guess you just gotta give these workers sick leave. But we never get to that point because there is this fiction, this elaborate fiction that is created, and I would argue with the tacit endorsement of even the most progressive people in the House, that something had to be passed to avoid negative consequences. The media has forced us to basically align with industry interests and to say that the worst thing that could happen is for the strike to occur, when in fact the worst thing that could happen is what actually happened, which is for the government, with the full support and backing of the Democratic Party, crushed a railroad strike, crushed one of the biggest unions in the country and what could have been a really transformative moment for labor in the United States of America.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you sort of like getting into the weeds, which I'm sorry to have asked you to do, but I think it's helpful to like grab.
No, I'm happy to do it. I just don't want to put everybody to sleep. But I mean, the fact that all of these things are opaque, it was the same thing with the $15 minimum wage and the parliamentarian and what is parliamentary procedure. And the part of the strategy is making it so difficult to understand that the narrative that Democrats try their best is a much easier one to swallow. And I know that perhaps sounds uncharitable. I have no interest. I don't want it to be the case that Democrats weren't the good guys in all of these situations. But I think part of my personal project, part of what I've come to believe is very important for any change to happen is for people to realize that this isn't a right-left issue. This is a top-down issue. And corporate influence doesn't stop because there's a D on your name, on the back of your name in Congress.
Yeah. That's the soundbite.
Okay, so that was a great exploration of this how corporate influence may have manifested itself specifically in the rail worker TA. So I'm going to follow up with a bit broader question. There are many ways corporations can influence political decision makers beyond exploiting weak campaign finance regulations. For example, one of the most effective tactics that defense contractors employ to capture these politicians is to offer industrial jobs in nearly every congressional district across the country, which anchors their business objectives to the members' parochial interests. Given that the captured legislators are also the people who can pass laws to regulate corporate influence, it feels like the deck is stacked. What methods of capture do you view as most nefarious, and how do we tackle them?
You cut a little bit there for me in the middle. You were just starting to say that offering contracts in states is one way to get people on board. Was there something after that?
No, that was just an example of
okay.
One way they can do it without just donating to campaigns. So, what other methods are there that you view as penetrating the legislators?
So we talked about the media a little bit. But if we just stay with the railroad strike example for a moment, and I think it's an instructive one, I don't think you can overstate how big a moment that actually was in terms of a lot of folks' realizations of how little there is anybody there to help, of how impenetrable the corporate grip really is. And part of the problem was that, so I said, the best case scenario for the left is for the thing to either fail or for an agreement with workdays to be passed, because if the agreement fails and workers go on strike, that's the whole point. And they're a very powerful union. They were more organized. They had a bigger strike fund than most other unions, and they ostensibly had the capacity to bring the country to its heels and extract their demands. However, there has been some reporting that the union itself was not especially prepared to go on strike. And that was part of the issue, that it was a bit of an empty threat. And something that can happen is that when unions become larger, they can become captured, they become corporatized. And even if there is it's not as bad faith as certain other kinds of capture, the fact of having a lot of money at one's disposal can lead sometimes union leadership to say, I have an obligation not to squander this. I have other kinds of obligations to my members, and am I really willing to pull the trigger now that I have all of these funds to basically protect? And so I find that it's less insidious, but in some ways more frustrating, because it's a kind of a protectionism that's very short-sighted, that has the effect of neutering unions of their greatest power, their only real power, the ability for them to withhold their labor. And I see a similar kind of reasoning. I can't prove it. My perception is that there's a similar kind of reasoning that's infected, I think, some good faith members of Congress, a lot of progressives in the House, for instance, who have gotten there, who argued when they were campaigning to get into Congress that they would rather be a one-term congressperson than not fight. my impression is that once you're elected, you are privy to certain powers and your ability to deliver for your constituents in ways that are meaningful, if smaller than the kind of systemic changes that we're focused on. And it can be difficult to say, I'm going to give that up. I'm going to risk throwing them back to the wolves. I'm doing something. Isn't it better that I'm here doing something? Should I really be risking it all on any number of Hail Marys that some random internet podcaster wants me to do? And while I kind of emotionally understand that perspective, I just think it's very short-sighted and not exactly corporate capture, but akin to the kind of psychological and corporate capture that you see in the context of some of these professionalized unions. And I guess the other thing that I would really just emphasize is exactly how pernicious the media is. So we have this basic understanding that when you're watching MSNBC and there's an advertisement for Raytheon, it's not because your aunt sitting next to you is going to be like, oh, that's a sick-looking missile. Let me call up and see. I was price comparing the missiles from Lockheed Martin and the missiles from Raytheon, and I really needed an advertisement to help me figure out which one I wanted to buy, right? So why are defense contractors who only have one client, the American government, advertising, spending millions of dollars in advertising on Joe Scarborough or whatever? And it's because advertisers have influence on the content of these programs. And people will deny it, and they'll say there's Chinese walls, and they'll say there's distance, and okay, but that's not how it works. And any number of people who used to work in media and who have left, people like Crystal Ball, who used to work at MSNBC, even people like Cenk Uygur, they will tell you about the subtle messaging that they received about, don't talk about this, we're not supposed to say that, run this by the bosses before you say X, Y, and Z. I had my own kind of moment at Rising this year where I considered walking off the show because what I perceived to be a content-based censorship of one of the guests, a friend of mine who is sometimes on the show, or used to be frequently on the show. So that's a very real thing that happens. It happens with the pharmaceutical industry as well. There are any number of drugs that aren't the kind of drugs that you're picking and choosing between. It's just, is it medically indicated? Does your doctor prescribe it or not? And yet we are inundated with ads about pharmaceuticals. And again, it has to do with the kind of coverage that you're going to get on the show after that. And even a less discussed, but I think an increasingly discussed form of capture is the kind of thing that we saw with Sam Bankman-Fried as well. So everyone knows, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. If you're a billionaire, the thing that you do is buy a media company. Elon Musk is the most discussed example right now. But there was also this thing that happened with Sam Bankman-Fried, whose fund crashed and burned, losing billions of dollars. He's currently in jail. I won't go through all the details of that particular story, but the first angle of coverage was that he was a prolific Democratic Party donor, right? He was a prolific Democratic Party donor and had also given an enormous amount to the media, and people thought that that was perhaps why he had gotten such favorable, wonderkind media coverage over the course of his meteoric rise. He got the Elizabeth Holmes treatment, and he started his own, he had substantially funded a number of more smaller independent outlets like Semaphore, for instance. And I think he also substantially had funded Vox. There are a lot, he had his fingers in a lot of pools, which leads people to ask, did those institutions pull punches and not investigate what maybe was a kind of an obvious house of cards before it actually all ended up coming down? And I really don't think it can be overstated what it means when there is so little independent media and so few people who are willing to ask difficult questions of these kinds of figures. And I don't think it's an accident that when there is genuinely independent media, it's very infrequent that you see congressional representatives willing to sit down and respond to questioning from folks who don't have an interest in access journalism, getting them back, and who also have the ability to ask questions freely without upsetting advertisers.
While we're on the topic of media, in a 2021 interview with Vanity Fair, You pointed out that one major difference between the right and the left is that the media arm and the organizing arm of the right are in lockstep, whereas the left has no such symbiosis. This provides the right with a strong advantage in creating narratives and swaying popular opinion. Given that corporations also own mainstream media outlets, is it possible for the left to create an anti-corporate media analog to amplify the voices of its organizers? And if not, what alternatives are there?
Whether or not it's possible, it will be very difficult. Whether or not it's very difficult, I believe people have to try. That alignment of interest is a huge obstacle. It's the reason why an outlet like MSNBC is willing to have a never Trump Republican on long before it has a leftist on. You'll have people like, what's his face, Steele and Liz Cheney and, what was Bush's former commswoman, they'll all get long-term contracts. Full-on Republicans, Nicole Wallace will have a primetime show at a ostensibly liberal outlet because there's an alignment of interest there. And that sounds overly cynical, but I promise you, I got there over time and not overnight, and it is what, that's my argument, that's my perception at very least. And so that's particularly why it's so frustrating that I think some left members of Congress don't understand why it's important for them to actually go on independent left media and empower them. Even though there is this corporate alliance of interest between kind of right-wing conservative politics and corporate TV, independent right media also gets more support from right media figures than independent left media gets from left media figures. Now, there's a lot of money sloshing around. I mean, I look at and envy at Candace Owens' set. And she looks gorgeous. I mean, it's an amazing set. Her lighting team, it's terrific. So I'm not saying it is also easier for them because it's a lot easier for them to get funding. If we want funding, we have to get $5 a month from regular people who often struggle to have that money, or get the occasional benevolent, affluent person. There's a Disney heir that's a leftist. We've got some celebrities like the wonderful Susan Sarandon who are so supportive of shows like ours, but on the whole, we just don't have those same fundraising mechanisms. So it is harder. I'm not saying that there's an imbalance there, but it means that we have to work even harder to have a kind of a more organic reach. Now, independent shows are enormously successful. Shows like Jimmy Dore's and Russell Brand's have 1 million subscribers and often get more viewership than cable news shows. Cable news is really struggling because nobody wants to watch two corporatists who have the same opinions but different letters behind their names sit there and say the exact same things about endless wars, et cetera. It's just not interesting. But a thing will eventually happen that if shows get too successful, independent shows get too successful because they are reliant on the infrastructure of YouTube or Facebook, these major media corporations that have very opaque algorithms. Ultimately, if you are doing the right work, if you're sufficiently a threat, you can be stopped. And I think that's why a lot of leftists, despite having no substantive sympathy for the kind of activities that went on Parler, for instance, around 1/6, are worried about what it means for entire apps to be shut down, taken out of the App Store, et cetera, because there's an ideological disagreement with what's happening on an app. There are frustrations about what goes on with the algorithms at places like YouTube and Facebook. There has been an explicit push to center, how do they characterize it? They don't call it real news, but they basically center corporate news on YouTube and these other apps. So MSNBC, CNN, Fox all get pushed by the algorithm, and small channels that used to be able to grow enormously 5-10 years ago now are stuck. Their subscriber counts don't move. The algorithm doesn't suggest independent media at all, like in the For You column, the way that it used to. And it could get even worse than that. And that's part of why you see people moving to other outlets and trying to diversify to places like Rumble or Rockfin, et cetera. But the whole point of a lot of these apps is that everyone's on them. The centrality of them is key. So it's good to have the backups of the other apps, but fundamentally it's a huge obstacle to overcome, that even your own merit and the public interest in the things that you're saying aren't enough to actually carry the day and spread your message. So yeah, you have to be really kind of gumshoe about it. It's very, very difficult, but I don't know what the alternative is, to be honest. And it seems to me that until the moment where there is a more explicit suppression of left media, where you're actually prevented from saying anything at all on these apps, that you have to use them and exploit them to your best benefit while you absolutely can. And I say support independent media, if not financially, like videos, repost, retweet, because it really is that much of an uphill battle. And I really do think that the goal right now has to be, I don't mean I'm proselytizing a little bit, which I probably shouldn't do, but someone was asking me on my call-in show last night why I focus on Democrats and why I'm not spending more time being critical of Republicans. And I would say that part of the reason is the people who are supposed to agree with me ideologically on some of these big things. Okay, corporate influence is a bad thing. Democrats are supposed to agree with that, right? Democrats are supposed to not like Citizens United. We're all agreed. Okay, well, what does it mean? Let's look at the coverage of Biden's new appointment of Chief of Staff, Jeff Zients. Now, the way I covered it on my show, the way David Sirota, who was Bernie's speechwriter and a veteran journalist, covered it over at The Lever, is that he is someone who spent his entire career in the pharmaceutical industry, who was then moved to be COVID czar with a huge conflict of interest, that he was sued repeatedly in his previous private sector capacity for overcharging the government for Medicare and Medicaid payments, and was sued, I think, $1.7 million, and in another case, $150 million, when there was a whistleblower in the $150 million case that came forward and said, hey, you guys, we're overcharging the government for these Medicaid payments. He said, the company said, hey, let's wait and see. Basically, don't say anything about it until we get caught, and then fired the whistleblower. This is a person, one of the companies involved is like the second largest provider of senior services in the United States of America. I mean, this is a huge level fraud. And you're going to take this guy, put him in as COVID, make him COVID czar, have completely woefully inadequate COVID policies, and then basically promote him to being chief of staff. Now, I cover that the way you just heard me describe it, as a fraudulent human being elevated to a position of power, and an indication of Biden's perhaps commitments to the pharmaceutical industry before the interest of the public. I listened, and with all due respect, I listened to Pod Save America, and their coverage was very different. I tweeted about it earlier this week. If you want to go and find it specifically, you don't have to take my word for it. I clipped the segment. I think it speaks for itself. But Jon Favreau basically said that he thought it was wrong. He gets very frustrated when people judge folks by what they did in the private sector as opposed to their record in government, and that was unfair, and that we should wait and see and trust that he's going to work in the interest of the American public. So why do I focus on this Democrat critique, and why do I think it's so important to have media outlets that are telling this kind of story? It's because what we have right now is primarily focused on running cover and distracting from the extent to which there are two corporate parties. And I don't care if you want to rank them. I don't care if you want to say Democrats are better than Republicans. At a certain point, what does it matter if they are working in lockstep toward very similar goals? That's not to say that there's not meaningful differences. That's not to say that there are things that Republicans and Donald Trump did that Democrats wouldn't have done that meaningfully and deeply impact the lives of millions of Americans, and that those marginal differences don't justify whatever your voting choices are, et cetera. That's completely fine. I'm not here to tell anybody what to do. But I would like there to be a more perfect information system than there is currently. And that is what, and there's no confusion about what Republicans are doing among Democrats. There's an enormous amount of confusion about what Democrats are doing among Democrats and left-leaning people. And so much of that story is a story of of corruption and corporate influence. And that is, in my view, the story to tell.
Briahna, I'm going to ask you to actually stay on that for a moment, because you frequently cover on your show, the sort of mobilization of the Democratic Party machine against progressive challengers. Like one example that's very dear to me, being from the Cleveland area, is the Nina Turner, Shontel Brown race and the role of DMFI, but you've also, covered various progressive challengers, the race between Guatemala and Quebec, for example, but many others. So I'm curious if you can, sort of staying on this topic of like understanding corporate nature of the parties, and what is an important conversation to be having on the left, if you could talk a little bit about corporate influence fueling those internal party divisions, and if in light of that you see progressive challengers as a realistic field of confrontation for leftists and progressive, or not.
Oh gosh, I thought maybe I'd get through this without talking about force the vote, but here we are. So, as you might be aware, a couple of weeks ago, there was a standoff over whether or not Republicans would vote for Kevin McCarthy to be Speaker of the House. Because of narrow majorities in the House, because there was such a slim majority for Republicans, it only took a small handful of conservatives, I believe, to say that they would not vote for Kevin McCarthy, to hold the process indefinitely. At one point, over 100 years ago when this happened, there were over 100 rounds of voting. It didn't get that far this time. I think it was, 15 before they finally figured it out? But as a consequence of holding out, the 20 Freedom Caucus holdouts were able to extract some very real concessions, some of which are things that I personally would not ask for because I have very different politics than those people, some of which were limitations on the power of the speaker that I think are substantively good, regardless of what party is involved, because the speaker has so much power to decide what bills are even heard on the floor. There was recently kerfuffle last week, or earlier this week, over this ban on stock trading bill, which Josh Hawley just reintroduced, calling it the Pelosi Act, and the acronym, you got to give them points. It lines up perfectly. It's not one of those tortured acronyms. I forget what it's called. It's like prevent election, I don't know, whatever. Pelosi, Google it. Anyway, the point is that Pelosi wouldn't bring that. She was openly hostile to being prohibited from trading stocks, and killed that bill when she was Speaker of the House very quietly, and has the power to do so. It doesn't matter if there's enormous public interest in the bill, public support for the bill, even support within Congress. Speaker of the House has those kinds of powers. So these Freedom Caucus members were able to extract a lot of power, frankly, from the speaker before they were willing to actually vote for him and to confirm him. And one of the things that they extracted was a commitment for Kevin McCarthy not to use his own super PAC to interfere in Republican primaries. Now, you might be thinking, again, these are Republicans. What does this have to do with me? What does it have to do with Shontel Brown, Nina Turner, Cleveland, et cetera? Well, as it turns out, Hakeem Jeffries, minority leader, also has a super PAC, and also has had a long-standing commitment to and support of AIPAC, who also has a super PAC. And DMFI, AIPAC super PAC, Hakeem Jeffries PAC are all focused on interfering in Democratic primaries against progressives. Hakeem Jeffries' super PAC in particular, his PAC in particular, with Terry Sewell and Josh Gottheimer, is explicitly designed with the purpose to protect establishment incumbents against progressive insurgents, or progressives, regardless of whether or not they're an incumbent or insurgent. The Democrats have kind of like given up on pretending that it was just about protecting incumbents and it wasn't that they were anti-progressive. Now they're just fully going after progressives, regardless of whether or not they're already in office. And when you've seen this with all of the challenges of the squad members over the last 2 years or so. Okay, imagine a world where back in 2021, when Democrats had a slim margin in the House, had the exact same power to extract concessions, there had been a similar successful concession extracted and a prohibition against the Democratic Party getting involved in any number of these primary races. DMFI spent millions of dollars against Summerlee in Pennsylvania. She squeaked through by the skin of her teeth. Nina Turner, as you mentioned, was less successful. DMFI spent millions of dollars to support Shontel Brown. By the way, the so-called Progressive Caucus also got in line and endorsed Shontel Brown in one of the most stunning betrayals I've had a front row seat to in my short political career. And they've been doing that work all across the country. I believe Democrats got involved in the race between Henry Cuellar and Jessica Cisneros in Texas. Henry Cuellar was an anti-choice Democrat running against a pro-choice Latina in a electoral context where Roe v. Wade was the only thing that saved Democrats from losing both chambers. And Nancy Pelosi flew down there, stumped for the Democratic Party establishment, advocated for Henry Cuellar to win. So back in 2021, when some of us were saying, hey, this is an unprecedented moment because of the narrow margins in the House for progressives to get some extractions, and many parts of the progressive media infrastructure were very negative about this idea. They seemingly value their relationship with the squad members and having them on their shows more than holding them to account and pushing them to take this calculated political risk and hold out in order to get real meaningful benefits. That opportunity passes by. But you can easily imagine a world where the progressive win-loss sheet looks a little bit better because they were able to keep the man who is now minority leader from using his influence, his super PAC, his powers, to go after progressives in particular. I'm sorry, was that responsive to the question? I kind of forgot what it was.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up the topic of force the vote, because that was going to be my next question.
Terrific.
Yes. So while we're on this subject, you were one of the leaders of the calls for progressive members of Congress to hold their vote back in the beginning of the 117th 2021 Congress, so that perhaps the squad or other Justice Democrats could force the vote by bringing a Medicare For All bill to the House floor, which everyone acknowledged was doomed to fail. But my question is, how would this have made Medicare For All more viable as a policy, or made the progressive left more powerful or respected in Congress?
Great question. So you've heard me mention a few times now that I think I've come to the conclusion, and I'm happy to moot this and talk it through if people disagree, but I've come to the conclusion that one of the most important things I can do in my limited role as a media figure, and what I think progressive journalists should be focused on, is heightening the contradictions between what the Democratic Party say they're going to do and who they say they represent and what their actions actually are. Because I think currently the mainstream media is designed, and many elected politicians see their role as obscuring the extent to which there is much more alignment between the two corporate parties than most of the public realizes. Medicare for All is a policy that has overwhelming support at this point. I believe 88% of Democrats and 49% of Republicans support it. I'm sorry, all my polls are from like the 2020 era, because that's when I was on a campaign citing polls, so apologies if there's been some movement since then. I'm not trying to intentionally misrepresent anything. But so it's safe to say overwhelming majorities of people support Medicare for All. At the time we were advocating for this, it was also hot in the middle of the pandemic. It was before vaccines had come out. People were missing holidays, staying at home, quarantining, everything was closed, schools were in session, et cetera. And 15 million people were estimated to have lost their health insurance as a consequence of losing their jobs. Because in America, your ability to get health care depends on your ability to be employed, which in any other part of the world is an insane statement. It's something that we just accept as the way the world works. Okay. So Bernie had just lost, and the podcast was new, and I had just done a series of interviews, including with a person who was Bernie's healthcare czar, I don't know what the exact title was, who had also been in NNU leadership, National Nurses Union leadership, and also DSA leadership many years ago. He was a real veteran across the board, Michael Leidy. And in the context of that conversation, I said, well, what now for Medicare for All? Like, what's next? What's the next move? And he was very transparent, and I appreciated this about the fact that he basically believed there was no proximate time horizon for Medicare for All. Maybe 20 years from now, if there, we'll have a state-by-state approach, and Gavin Newsom might get Medicare for All in California, and then bring it to the White House if he becomes president. And like, this was the new field of horizon. And I said, it seems to me that sitting around waiting for Gavin Newsom as he's having his COVID-era parties at French Laundry isn't necessarily the best look for a progressive movement that had so much energy behind it coming out of the Bernie campaign. We can't just sit around. We should harness this. We should do something with it. And so when the force the vote idea percolated up, it seemed obvious to me that it could have multiple benefits. One, highlighting the contradictions between what progressives, what Democrats as a party say that they support, and also heightening the contradiction, between what they say that they support and what they're actually willing to do, as compared to what the public quite obviously wanted. And I think an opportunity to see Democrats justifying why they weren't going to use executive orders to greatly expand access to health care or anything short of Medicare for All in the context of a pandemic, which they were saying was so exigent, which they had already committed to as being so important. That the contradiction between their rhetoric around the pandemic in particular and around their support of healthcare reform in general and their refusal to basically fight for it in any way, I think would have been an important teaching moment for the American public, which, as I've mentioned, is I think what my core goal is here right now. Moreover, there were people who said, well, it wasn't going to be enough of a spectacle. I think as we saw 2 weeks ago, it was quite the spectacle, and it could have been even a bigger spectacle because they could have held out indefinitely. It could have been weeks, it could have been months, it could have been whatever. And part of your concessions could also be designing what the hearing process looks like on Medicare for All. So back in 2018, I believe it was, maybe 2019, there were hearings on Medicare for All, but they weren't called hearings on Medicare for All. It was like hearing on something health reform. Richie Neal, I believe, administered the hearing. He's very hostile to any kind of healthcare reform, Medicare for All in particular. And the hearings really, they didn't take the opportunity to question Congress members and confront Congress members on their corporate donations from the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry, their conflicts of interest, the kind of things that I think really help the public to understand why it is we don't have Medicare for All. Because right now, what's the narrative from the Democratic Party? We just got to get more votes. We just got to convince people. We just got to get more people in Congress. Well, you don't have to convince anybody. Everyone's in agreement. If Congress did what the public wanted, we'd have Medicare for All. And when we had a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president, there was less of an ability to just blame Republican intransigence on not having Medicare for All. So again, I think the hearings would have been really important. And now 2 years later, when we haven't seen any conversation about not just Medicare for All, but any healthcare reform. Remember when Biden said he was going to expand upon Obamacare with a public option? What have you heard about that? But for Republicans really coming for Social Security and Medicare right now, I think that you'd see, frankly, Joe Biden doing much of the same. He's tried it in the past, and he has continued some aspect of Medicare, Trump-era Medicare privatization programs to date. So I think it would have been an important boost to the movement to remind people that this is something that they should continue to be fighting for, because right now they basically have permission from even the most progressive parts of our Congress to drop the issue. It's a non-issue. That's the consensus. It's a non-issue. And, at least 68,000 people a year continue to die from a lack of health care. That was the number before we had COVID. God knows what it is now. By some estimates, 1/3 of all COVID deaths could have been prevented if we had had a universal health care system. I don't think there's ever a bad opportunity to fight for Medicare for All. It is also, of course, true that they could have asked, as I mentioned earlier, for any number of concessions. And honestly, if it had really been about the fact that the Medicare for All ask wasn't going to result in literal Medicare for All as a policy, then I and a lot of others were very open to hearing alternative asks. And we advocated for other asks. David Sirota brought a bunch of other asks to the table in a way that was really constructive. Unfortunately, the left became fractured, and it became a fight about how stupid it was to ask for anything, or how asking for anything meant that you just hated the squad and were out to get them and you wanted to hurt them, as opposed to focusing on how to structure an ask to be most beneficial to the people we're supposed to be fighting for and the audiences we're supposed to be really fighting for from these platforms.
Yep, thank you for that. And I have a host of other questions, but unfortunately, we are out of time. So on behalf of the conference, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and imparting all that terrific knowledge with us. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brianna.